So hi there, everybody. Welcome to episode 284 of The Art of Procurement. And we are doing a slightly early this month in procurement due to the fact that it's Thanksgiving week here in the US. And so I'm joined as ever, well, I say as ever, but for the first time in person across the table from each other, joined by Kelly Barner. Kelly is the owner and managing director of Buyers Meeting Point and also the general manager here at Art of Procurement. So Kelly, welcome, and it's great to be doing this in person for a change.
I know, I was actually going to thank you for having me, and then I remembered, no, that's right, you're in my backyard this time, so welcome to Boston.
Yeah, very cold Boston, as you have heard nothing more. You know, you've heard for the last, I think, day and a half about how I'm shivering here now that I'm, I don't know what a Floridian, I guess I'm a Floridian
I suppose
at this point.
So. Yeah, and I don't know how to tell you, the cold hasn't even begun yet.
Right.
This is nothing.
No, I used to live in Detroit, so I kind of remember it, but, you know, I forgot my jacket because the mindset isn't even there. Yeah, so it's a little chilly. And so we are doing this, as I mentioned, a little bit earlier than we would ordinarily do because of Thanksgiving. And so we thought we'd put this in Thanksgiving as opposed to waiting until the beginning of December for the typical schedule for this month in procurement. What we're going to do in today's show is we're going to have a brief discussion on the previous couple of pods that we've had since the last time we got together. We'll go a little bit into our topic for this month, which is going to be about stepping away from your traditional environment. And then we'll just give you a little bit of teaser into what's coming for the rest of the year now. I say it's usually the rest of the month, but
jeez, that's crazy.
Yeah, here we are recording this 19th of November and not that long to go until 2020. You know, 2020, the decade when all of procurement was going to be touchless and automated and none of us were going to have jobs.
And we were all going to take our flying cars on those vacations we can take because we don't have to have jobs anymore.
Yeah, so now we can talk about how that's all going to happen in 2030 instead. So let's first of all go into this month on the pod. And we had a couple of different pods this month. The first one we had was with Bill Michaels. Bill is the VP of Operations for the Americas for SIPS, longtime friend of the show. And we talked about a bunch of stuff. You know, Bill is really... Bill's deeply ingrained into the supply chain, let's say the direct procurement side, as much, if not more, than the indirect side. We talked about tariffs and the continuing impact on procurement, but also a little bit about starting to think about planning for recession. And it's interesting, you know, it's one of those things that when the economy is going, you often don't make changes until it's too late. And yet procurement is so well positioned for when a recession does happen to make an impact. You know, that's where we can really come and really help our organizations in ways that are, I think, are critical. So yeah, that was basically what we talked about.
And it's a thought process thing too, right? It's not just recession planning, it's thinking about supply chain disruptions, right? The day after a disruption, it's the only thing anybody can talk about. Yeah. Next thing you know, it's 2 weeks later or 30 days later and things have somewhat calmed down and nobody's thinking about disruption anymore, right? We go from feast to famine.
Right.
And it's always thinking about if things are good, what will we do if things stop being good? If things are bad, we should be thinking ahead to what are we going to try to implement or change once things level off and improve. So we always have to be thinking bigger picture. Yeah,
and I think a lot of it is, good risk mitigation principles.
Absolutely.
Because, being in a way you start going into recession, the first thing that comes to your mind is, okay, I got to help my company save cost. The bigger risk is often how can I make sure that the supply base that I rely on are able to continue functioning and operating because they're under some of the same pressures. You know, when it was in the automotive space, it's like a double-edged sword. On one hand, you're going after your suppliers, begging them essentially for 3-5% cost reduction. But on the other hand, you do that and suddenly you're taking them out because they don't have the cash flow and you've got a much bigger problem on your hand. So it's kind of balancing the need to be competitive, but whilst also the need to protect your supply base.
And understanding things in depth. Do you think that you've actually diversified when right underneath the surface, tier 2, it's all one distributor, right? That's not really diversified. It doesn't matter how many trucks those boxes of widgets come to you on. If they're all pulling from the same warehouse, you have a single point of failure setting up.
Yeah, we talk about that in, I think it was a concept that was more introduced to me when I was in financial services because it was a requirement from a regulatory perspective, but the idea of concentration risk. So, you talk about it from a direct supply chain perspective, but you can have that from an indirect perspective when you may feel like you have multiple, it's an example I always give because it was one that I actually lived, was in the call center space where you think you have multiple call centers, so you've distributed your employees, they're all in the same city. They all take the same train to get to work. And so even though you have 5 different suppliers, well, if something happens from a geographic perspective,
that's right,
you can have the same problem.
Absolutely.
And then the second pod that we had this month was with David Ray, who's the Chief Product Officer, and Geraldine Craven, who's the Head of Research, Chief Research Officer at Procurement Leaders. And that was based on a study that they did called A CPO's Guide to Planning for 2020, and also research that Procurement Leaders has done throughout the year because they have a really strong program of events where they're able to, kind of glean a lot of insights from that go into the report that they built. And so obviously, we always, when we see these reports, is about cost savings. That never goes away. But there was a lot of talk in that about value beyond savings. What are the different levers that we can pull, and specifically around innovation and, again, risk management, risk mitigation, which is kind of a common theme as one of those areas where we can look at doing, again, kind of getting into in a little bit more detail from a procurement perspective that we haven't necessarily really embraced, even though we've talked about it for a long time.
And thinking about transformation, too, in the sense of the broader changes that are happening. One of the questions that I really enjoyed from this conversation, and I think part of what makes it interesting is that there isn't an answer to this question, is the idea of whether it's easier to drive a procurement transformation effort when some amount of change is already underway in the organization or on the team versus saying, okay, everything is stable right now. We have some changes we need to bring about. So let's all focus around driving this change. It's almost like sometimes getting people into the mindset of having change take place makes it easier to get more change going as opposed to trying to build some momentum from a stopped position.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the question I posed to David was around, does he see that you're doing one or the other, on a consistent basis? And the answer was basically no. It's very situational based on the organization. But when an organization is in that change mindset, it can either work for you or against you because you can have change fatigue where people are just, we've changed so much. Why do I need to go through that? Big part of change management when that happens is bringing people along with you. And
if you're leading change and you start to sense that fatigue from the people around you, that is a red flag that the management of that change and the communication around that change has gotten sloppy or unfocused or no longer connects to the work that people are doing on a daily basis. So as common as it is, it's definitely something to be concerned about.
So let's go into the topic for this week. I feel like we're racing along here. And it's funny, one, I think that's our intent this week because it's Thanksgiving week. But also, when I'm recording in person, conversations are a lot faster than when I'm recording over the phone. I don't know if you found that. It's one of those interesting things where face-to-face there's so much power in face-to-face versus doing things over the phone that you kind of cover more ground quicker, I would say, than sometimes when you're doing it.
Well, you can certainly read the cues from the other person, right? Yeah, when you're going over the phone, okay, I'm going to leave that 1 or 2 second silence just because if we're both talking at the exact same time, it's horrible to listen to. It could also be that everyone in Boston just talks faster, and you're starting to. I think you got something there, maybe. To keep us warm.
So the topic was really about this idea of getting away. Given that we're here, we're actually going through 2020 planning for what the art of procurement looks like next year, where we focus, how we talk about the things that we do. When I look back to last year, so regular listeners may recall, at the end of 2018, we had all these brands all over the place, from learning and development and consulting and the podcast, and we brought everything under one roof, so everything was branded as Art of Procurement, so we could talk a little bit more intelligently about the things we do. That was step one. Step two is now to be a little bit more concrete in the value that we're creating. So we're going through this exercise in this offsite to figure out what our messaging looks like. And so more to come, obviously, in the next few weeks. You're going to see some of the really cool things we've been talking about, which I'm excited to share. But really today I wanted to talk about the idea of stepping away from your traditional environment and how powerful that can be to kind of change your mindset. Because when you're in a familiar environment, like the office where you spend all your work, you kind of get into, I don't know if it's the same visual cues or mental cues or whatever it is. It's hard to get out and have a different take or a different look at the world around you when you're in that environment.
Or even the work process is that to some extent grow out of the environment that you work in. So I certainly don't work in a traditional office environment anymore, but I think about when I did, you were very aware of sort of the rough rhythm of the office, right? There was sort of a mid to late morning coffee stop / meeting let out that would happen where there'd be more noise in the aisles. There would be sort of the lunch in and out. You'd become aware towards the end of the day. I can even remember one of my earliest professional jobs. There was a woman who worked right near me, and she would end every day by saying, "It's 5:04, I'm out the door." And you do as the energy starts to leave the office, mentally you think, oh, Phil has left.
Yeah.
Mary has left, right? Oh, everyone's leaving. Why aren't I leaving? You see it start to get dark, especially in the winter. You start to think about, okay, what's next? Where do I need to stop on the way home? You do have kind of an energy slump, right? You stop producing. So there are certainly routines. And I think it could be as simple as going to a conference room instead of sitting at your desk. Yeah. In our case, going to a shared meeting spot instead of being in separate states, working virtually. But it does change your focus, it changes your priority, and it changes your thinking, which is really the thing that you're trying to drive when you specifically step out of an environment.
Yeah, and I think especially as we come towards the end of the year, when the end of the year for all of us, or at least all of us that work on a calendar year perspective. Obviously some listeners will work in organizations that have a different financial year that may operate slightly differently than a calendar year. But, if you're operating on a calendar year basis, this is the time of year when you really started to think about what does next year look like. And part of that is challenging yourself to think about what are the things I want to change, or one of the things I want to do differently, or what are some of the different outcomes that I want to drive next year. And so just encourage if you have teams working for you, to encourage them to get out of the office. And getting out of the office might mean, now if you're in Boston, it might be a little bit cold to do this, but going out.
Suggest a picnic?
Yeah, going to the park or going to the beach or going to wherever it may be that's completely different than your typical work environment, where you don't have distractions that you usually do with a pen and a paper. It's amazing how inspired you can be when you're in that environment with none of your typical senses around you. You can build on that when you get back into the office of how I'm going to put that into practice. But take that opportunity if you have it as you start brainstorming, if you will, what next year looks like.
The other opportunity from this is typically there's a moment when you step back. And whether it's a normal weekend or whether it's a lengthened weekend around something like Thanksgiving, it might even be a week and a half or 2 weeks for some people around the Christmas holiday. Yep. Don't pass up the opportunity to stop and think about how things look when you come back. And I can remember even working as a consultant 60 to 80 hours a week. Every Friday you'd go home, you'd come back on Monday morning, and I started leaving myself notes because you had such little time away that it was still jarring. I would get back on Monday morning and I would think, I don't even know what I do here. What is my job? And when you start taking bigger times away, it can be jarring, but sometimes that feeling of disconnectedness gives you objectivity. You might start thinking, this report that I was so bogged down in trying to create at the end of last week, would anybody notice? Am I doing this because it's habit? Am I doing this because there's value? Does a new idea suddenly occur to you? Is there something else that you can change? Sometimes it's a matter of You've been struggling with a problem for a long time. You step away, you come back to it, and boom, the answer's just there because you stepped away.
Yeah.
So I always think that how you manage yourself and your team through the process of deliberately re-engaging, it's such an amazing opportunity for new insights or gaining perspective or getting rid of things that just simply don't need to be done anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lots of opportunity to really start shaping your new year right now.
Yes.
And something that we talk about, I think it's a part of our values as well that we've been working on the last few days, is believing in the power of your own choices.
Yes.
As you go out and you start to think about what my choices are going to be next year, realize that the things that you maybe not everything you can control, but there's so many more things that you can control with your decisions than perhaps you give yourself credit for.
Absolutely true. And it might just be small choices. Mm-hmm. Even if you work at a big, big company and a lot of things are decided for you, there are still choices you are making that are within your control that can change your situation.
So with that being said, let's start to just wrap up. We said today would be a shorter episode. Given that it's Thanksgiving week this week, I think it's appropriate time just to thank everybody for listening. The podcast would be nothing truly without all of your support as you're listening in, encouragement that we get, and hopefully we're providing a little bit of value that's worth the time that you invest in this every week. But I want to thank you for really being a part of our community. It means so much.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, and Kelly, thank you, for all the work that you do to support what we're doing here at Art of Procurement, and it's a godsend. It really is. So I'm thankful every day for the support that you're able to share and help us drive forward on the mission that we're moving on.
And not only am I thankful to be a part of it, I'm thankful for the whole community of friends that we have around us. I mean, there are people who just listen. There are people who listen and share. There are people who comment. There are people who make suggestions. There are people that criticize, and we are thankful and we are made better every single day by all of those people in the community. What's
great about the procurement community, and I found this when I stepped out of my day job into doing what I'm doing, and I've spoken with other people who have done the same, is that the vast majority of the community is really in it to help each other.
Agreed.
We kind of looking at, we're all collectively, it's our goal to help elevate the profession so that we all benefit. And, you see that with the amount of people who are willing to come on the show and dedicate their time to sharing their experiences and insights. You see it with all the partnerships across the procurement space. When you look at all the partnerships with providers who are, you could look at it objectively and say, well, those are competitors. Well, there are so many people who work together for the betterment of the profession, and with a perspective that there's something in it for everybody, as opposed to being very defensive. So I think we're very lucky to be in the profession that we're in.
There is no question. We definitely are.
So let's look for the remainder of the year. We have 3 more episodes left. We'll be talking with Peter Smith. Peter, it's always somebody of a lot of opinions. You just follow him on Twitter. And as I say to him in the show, especially when he's got a couple of wines in him, he's particularly entertaining. So Peter was the editor of Spend Matters in the UK and has written a book which really brings together a lot of his insights that he wrote for Spend Matters in the UK, called a Procurement Compendium. So Peter will be up next week. Then we have the AOP Live webinar that we did earlier in the week with Per Angusta. It was about best practices for managing procurement performance. We're turning that into a podcast so that everybody can listen. That'll be the week after. And then we're going to wrap up the year with Sundar, and I'm not going to butcher his surname at the moment, who is Global Head of Manufacturing Solutions at iValua. We're going to be talking about the direct materials, direct procurement space, and how, as somebody who grew up in direct procurement, some of that technology was pretty old. And here we are in 2020 almost, and it's really only starting to modernize. So we're going to talk about the impact of technology in the direct space as our last show of the year. That is going to take us all to, December the 16th for the last podcast, and then December the 18th for the last This Week in Procurement newsletter.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and that's the year.
Wow.
So let's wrap up there. Show notes for today's episode, which is going to include the links to the 2 podcasts that we talked about. Also, how to subscribe if you're not on the list to get our This Week in Procurement newsletter. There'll be details of how you can get that. And that's going to be at artofprocurement.com/episode 284. That's artofprocurement.com/episode 284. So, live from Boston, I guess. Thanks for joining me, Kelly.
Thank you very much for having me.
We'll do another one of these, I guess, towards the end of January, beginning of February.
That we will. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thank you very much. Take care. Hi there. I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.